to those that have managed to join this webinar so far. We wish to invite you to this occasion of the launch seminar of the 10th round findings of the Africa Integrity Indicators. We thank you for taking time to join us this afternoon for this conversation. My name is Mziwandile Ndlovu. I'm with AFIDEP, the African Institute for Development Policy. I am also a member of the project management team of the Africa Integrity Indicators, serving as Anglophone Africa project manager. Thank you for those that have managed to join. I'm assuming that all the speakers, all the discussants are in the room. I think I'll start just by saying a few things about the project that we are going to be focusing on today. A project that is now, which has just recently started being driven by the African Institute for Development Policy, the Africa Integrity Indicators, started in 2012, and we are just getting into the 11th round of the indicators. It is a flagship governance research project that has been run by Global Integrity since inception, whose aims are to support governments, civil society, the media in all of the 54 African countries to understand and evaluate the status quo of governance systems and generally the government trajectory on the continent. The project also seeks to generate quality, comprehensive, and timely governance indicators of various personalities, social, economic, political, and also anti-corruption mechanisms. The Africa Integrity Indicators also seek to stimulate the actions that address the persisting governance challenges in Africa. And this is actually an important space that the African Institute for Development Policy works in. The knowledge translation space, the space that seeks to use evidence to influence the policies of the 54 countries in which we work. So the project, besides the Africa Integrity Indicators, the Global Integrity still has some involvement as an advisory partner as we go into the 11th round. The strategic importance of the indicators are that they are also used by the World Bank in their programming and decision-making mechanisms, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation that also makes use of the Africa Integrity Indicators through the World Bank. So in a nutshell, that is what the Africa Integrity Indicators are about, and also a bit of information that we shared about the African Institute for Development Policy that is currently driving the project. Can I get a signal if Dr. Elia Zulu is with us?
So I'll be speaking on behalf of Dr. Elia Zulu, who is not able to join the panel this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rose. So we are now going to be going into the session where we are going to be receiving a presentation from Dr. Rose Olonje, who is now actually going to be speaking. She is the Director for Knowledge Translation here at the African Institute for Development Policy. She is going to give us a bit of opening remarks which are centering on the organization as well as the strategic value of the Africa integrity indicators to the organization. Over to you, Rose.
Thank you so much, Ziwandile. And I'll have to start with sharing apologies from Dr. Zulu, whom I've just been on a call shortly. He sends his apology that he's not able to join the panel, but I'm happy to share some remarks about AFIDEP, and I'm really honored to be here this afternoon. My name is Rose Oronje. At AFIDEP, I'm Director of Public Policy and Knowledge Translation. I also head our office in Kenya. And importantly, I head our governance and accountability work, which is where the Africa Integrity Indicators project lies. AFIDEP is 12 years old. So we were formed about 12 years ago in 2010. And the purpose of AFIDEP was to drive the use of evidence in improving the lives of Africans, the use of data, the use of research. And that means that we work hand in hand with governments, we work hand in hand with other development actors to support the decision-making, to support their governance processes. But importantly for us, the underpinning theme there is ensuring that we're supporting the use of data and the use of evidence in decision-making. Of course, AFIDEP has that premise because we believe that in Africa, there is a lot of research, there's a lot of information, but that doesn't get to be used optimally to improve people's lives. And that is why AFIDEP was formed several years ago. Our work is mainly in 5 broad areas. So governance and accountability is one of those areas of work where we have a range of work, and Africa Integrity Indicator is actually one of our flagship projects currently under that theme. But we also have work going on in population dynamics and development, perhaps a long-standing theme that has been there for many years. And we've done a lot of work with the African Union, with various partners across the different regions of Africa, as well as in more than 25 countries across the region. Apart from the population dynamics work, we also have work going on health and well-being, looking at the health systems in Africa, because we know that they have a big role to play if we are going to improve the livelihoods of many people. And so we implement work with African governments across the region, looking at how can evidence improve what the services being provided, but also even the programs and the policies being made. And for health, importantly, the budgets that the governments are putting in, because we know that much of the policies don't get implemented because the budgets being put in are quite minimal, and somehow they're not able to support the services that we want to reach everyone, especially when you think about the focus with many countries on universal health coverage, which means that we are trying to reach everyone, but are we putting in the money? And how can data, get us to the point where we can reach everyone? We also have a thematic area of work on education and skills development, perhaps much less developed than health and well-being and population and governance. But it's an area where we see that efforts, leadership, and evidence can drive investments that ensure that Africa is developing the skills that we need to drive our economies, so to drive economic growth, but also to drive other emerging issues on the continent. And finally, we have a 5th area of work, which is environment and climate change. Again, there is so much focus in the last couple of years on the changing environment. And for us, our focus is how are leaders looking at environment as it links with other things, so environment as it links to health, environment as it links to other sectors, and what role can data and research play in operationalizing those linkages. In a nutshell, those are the 5 areas where AFIDEP works. If I think about the work that we do, I would categorize it into 2 areas mainly. Much of the work we do will be looking at existing data, so analyzing that, synthesizing existing research, and providing answers, providing evidence to the questions that governments are asking, to the priorities of government. And so as a research institute, we don't do a lot of primary data collection, a lot of surveys, because we believe much of that is already existing in government databases. And so we look at that and speak to priorities that governments have, but also speak to questions or respond to questions that governments are asking. And when I say governments, of course, I mean parliaments as well. We do a lot of work with parliaments and not just ministries alone. The other part of our work is capacity development, and our capacity development, we look at it quite broadly. We look at it in terms of leadership, in terms of governance, in terms of individual technical skills, as far as decision-making is concerned. And so we have a wide range of projects touching on trainings, on evidence-informed decision-making, but we also have initiatives looking at how do we strengthen decision-making structures in various ministries at Parliament to improve decision-making. So finally, I think just note that for us, the Africa Integrity Partnership is so important for the Institute, because we look at this as an opportunity for us to drive the use of these indicators, the use of these data in decision making. And so taking this project on, of course, through a very strategic partnership with Global Integrity Indicators, the value for us was to be involved in improving governance. We know that governance underlies a lot of things. And at individual levels, I actually believe that if Africa does not address the governance challenges that we have currently, then a lot of development indicators will not change. And so for us, we see this as a very strategic partnership with the Global Integrity Indicators, who have been running this work for the last 10 years now, since 2012. They've been running this work and getting into this partnership. We've worked hand in hand with them for the past year. Of course, learning the ropes, but also just ensuring that we are building onto the very good work they've been doing over the years to be able to develop and release this scorecard that we're releasing today. And so we look at this as a very strategic partnership. We look at this, the project as very strategic for AFIDEP, but also for the continent. The value that we bring on board as AFIDEP is to move the data that we are releasing today into important conversations with key actors at the continental level, but also in various countries where we have a lot of partnerships and influence. And so for us, we are looking at this launch today as, you know, the beginning of us talking about this data and seeing how it can improve our governance systems. I mean, speak to some of the persisting challenges around accountability and around issues of equity and access to services for many Africans. And so we are hoping that we'll be able to facilitate conversations following on this launch with a wide range of stakeholders in different parts of the continent, different countries, to see how this data actually can trickle down into reforms that can improve people's lives. I can go on and on because I'm passionate about governance, I'm passionate about data, but I want to stop here and just thank our partners, Global Integrity. Time is everyone is very so much, and I'm looking forward to the presentations and the discussions today. Back to you, Mziwandile.
Okay, thank you very much, Rose, for those passionate opening remarks. Really speaking about the space that AFIDEP works in. It's a very important space of trying to synthesize existing research and helping governments with their development priorities. And also really explaining that regarding the Africa Integrity Indicators, if we did not do that work, the development indicators really are not going to change. So thank you very much. I think we can go along now with our program. And I'm going to introduce the next speaker. So the next speaker is the Governance and Accountability Thematic Lead here at the African Institute for Development Policy. He is the project lead of the Africa Integrity Indicators. May I now hand over to Dr. Alex Nestagia, who is going to take us through the next presentation, which is going to be speaking to the methodology that is used by the Africa Integrity Indicators. You can take us through, Alex.
All right, okay. Thank you, Swandile. My presentation will focus on the Africa Integrity Indicators methodology. In brief, I'll talk about the indicators, the publication process, the contributors, as well as the research period and the timelines. So the Africa Integrity Indicators uses what we call an evidence-based research methodology, where the research is conducted on the 54 indicators. So the indicators, they are divided into in law and in practice. And the in practice indicators, there are 54 in total, which are assessed every year. And then there are other 50 plus in-law indicators, which were last assessed in 2018. So right now we are only focusing on the in-practice indicators, mainly because the in-law indicators were not changing much over the period. So each indicator has 3 elements, which is the score, the explanatory comment, and the sources. So users, when they access these indicators, they look at the scores of the various countries, and also they are able to refer to the comments within the indicators, and then try to understand why those specific country or a country has achieved a particular score on any given indicator. So the scores, they have the scores from 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100, where 0 means the country has a very weak score, 25 has weak score, then all the way to a very strong score, which is 100. In addition, since 2019, as I already highlighted, we have been focusing on the 54 in practice indicators. And these in practice indicators, they're further divided into 2 categories, which is the transparency and accountability category, as well as the social development category. In the transparency and accountability category, you have in total 30 indicators, which mainly looks at the issues of public procurement processes, media freedom, asset disclosure requirements, as well as independence of the judiciary, among others. For the social development indicators, we have 24 of them in total, which mainly focuses on gender issues, mainly looking at women representation in the National Assembly, the cabinet, as well as other issues. And we also have human rights indicators, welfare, business environment, health, and education. So when it comes to the publication process, once the data is collected, and starting from since 2016, we make the provisional data available to various stakeholders who use the data. And this provisional data is made available of the course from April to May of each year, where we allow various stakeholders in terms of governments or civil society or the media, among others, to comment on the data, so that if there are any issues with the scores or any information is missing from the comments, they can provide more information, and then we can try to rectify the issues which have been identified. So after this process, we usually publish the data in July, and this webinar also is there to publish this data. In terms of the contributors in the research process, we have 2 types of contributors, which are the in-country researchers as well as peer reviewers. The peer reviewers, further, they are divided into 2, which is the country-specific reviewers, and then we have also thematic reviewers. The country reviewers, normally they are experts in that country, and the thematic reviewers come in to assess the indicators based on themes. It can be gender, rule of law, as well as public integrity, among others. So the thematic experts, they will assess those indicators in that particular theme across the countries. So the in-country researchers uses an evidence-based investigation methodology, and after the data has been collected, it is now reviewed by the peer reviewers, which I've already explained who are they. So the data mainly is gathered through various sources, including a legal and scholarly review, news articles, as well as interviews with various experts in different countries. Then the scores are attributed thoroughly through a clearly defined criteria, meaning that each score, each indicator has a scoring criteria through which the researchers looks at it, and then it guides them in terms of giving the scores for these for the various indicators. The sources are visible to anyone who accesses these indicators in the because the sources are there to be transparent, and open to ensure that there's validity and reliability. This means that if someone looks at the indicator and then reads the comments, and then he or she should be able to verify through the sources the information which has been provided. We also follow a strict protocol to in terms of confidentiality of anonymous sources as well. In terms of the research period and the timelines, the research period is usually 12 months. That is from September of 1 year until September of the next year. So, like, for example, in the 10th round, the research period was from September 2020 to September 2021. This means that if we are conducting the research, like, for example, in the 10th round, the in-country contributors, they look at the evidence within that period of time. So, for example, we have launched the data collection for the 11th round. That means the researchers will be looking at the evidence between September 2021 to September 2022. So after this, the research is completed approximately 4 to 6 months after the close of the study period. An exception is for the first round, which was a pilot, in which it was published in 2013, and it had a period of study from June 2011 to September 2012. So in general, this is the timeline and the research process where we normally train our researchers, and then the research normally lasts 5 weeks, and after which the quality control processes take over, including the peer review process, the editing process, all the way until the provisional data is published. In general, that's the methodology for the Africa integrity indicators. Thank you, Zwandile, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that very enlightening presentation about the methodology and in general, the whole ecosystem of the Africa integrity indicators, as well as the various role players. Maybe just to add that this data has now been put out for all external audiences. It is there on the website of the Africa integrity indicators. I'm sure the various support colleagues that we're working with can just maybe put it there also in the chat section for those who may want to be having a look. So now that we have understood and received a presentation focusing on the methodology of the project, we are going to move along with our program for the day. And I am going to introduce and ask to speak the next speaker, who has been intimately involved with the Africa integrity indicators for quite a number of years. Somebody who has and continues to play an important advisory role and kind of mentorship role, really, of the indicators. Can I introduce Max Leviter, who is a project manager with Global Integrity, the organization that AFIDEP has inherited the project on. He has so much knowledge and intimate knowledge really about the project. Can I hand over now to you, Max? His presentation is the one that is actually going to be focusing on the findings of cycle 10 of the Africa integrity indicators. I hand over to you now, Max.
Thank you so much, Zwandile, for that really lovely introduction. And before I start my presentation, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure working with the AFIDEP team to transition the project over from Global Integrity to AFIDEP. I have full confidence in Alex, Zwandile, and their colleagues in taking over this project and really taking that data to new heights and being able to actually put it to good use on the African continent. So that's very exciting. Let me quickly share my screen and start the presentation. So I will be talking about the findings from round 10, which have just been released. So I'll start a little bit by talking about some just general indicator trends, both for round 10 specifically, and then also across the last 10 years of data collection. It's more of like a 50,000 foot view of the data. We have the data itself is much more rich on the country level, but looking at it kind of across the continent also gives us an idea of some interesting trends going on. And then we'll talk specifically about some country performance during this last round. So I'll talk first about the pandemic response. So we have one indicator that measures basically the use of health campaigns in response to health hazards and epidemics. So as you can see in this chart here, sorry, let me minimize this. As you can see in this chart here, we had a slight uptick from the last round into this round on this indicator. So this round really captured the last sort of year of the pandemic, or from September 2020 to September 2021, so a full year of the actual pandemic, including the vaccine rollout in many countries, and just an increase in sort of the response to the pandemic. So that's clearly reflected in this data. As we saw from the previous year, from 2020 to 2021, or for round 8 to round 9, there was a slight decrease in which that round captured the first 6 months or so of the pandemic. And some countries were not able to sort of keep up, which caused a slight decrease in that score. But as we've seen a slight rebound from round 9 to round 10 in this indicator. So that's a good sign for the trajectory of the pandemic response. This indicator, however, has always been one of our highest scoring indicators just across all years. So that also bodes pretty well. The other trend that we see kind of across the continent is an increase in women's representation. So we have 3 indicators that measure the women's representation in national cabinets, in the judiciary, and in the legislature. So as we've seen from round 9 to round 10 of the data, women's representation in cabinets went up, as well as women's representation in legislatures, while women's representation in judiciary has been the same, but as an overall trend has been increasing over the last 10 rounds of data collection. So this is obviously a very positive trend, and as more women become involved in politics, as countries continue to take gender into consideration when appointing cabinets and members of the judiciary, we expect this trend to continue. However, so the threshold for a 100 score, however, is only a 33% representation of women in those bodies, and only 14 countries have actually met that threshold for cabinets, and only 10 have met the threshold for women's representation in legislatures, but 21 countries have met that threshold for national level courts of the judiciary. So it's a positive trend, but there's still a lot of work to do. And finally, on a more dour note, we've seen a significant decline in the indicators that we have measuring government restraint of both media and online content. So we see that particularly in the indicator measuring government censorship of online content that's created by citizens. That indicator has continued to decrease over time, and a particularly sharp decrease from the last round to this round of over 250 points in the cumulative score across all countries. There's a slight uptick in the score for government restraint of media, but this is clearly offset by the steeper decrease in the score for government restraint of citizen created content. So this is a worrying trend, obviously, and we've seen it kind of continent-wide, and these are probably the 2 indicators that had the steepest decline over the course of the data collection over the last 10 years. So here we have just the highest and lowest performing countries. So as you'll see in the chart up here, the highest performing countries are South Africa, Mauritius, Seychelles, Namibia, and Tunisia. And so those have been, for the most part, or South Africa and Seychelles and Mauritius have South Africa and Mauritius have been consistently high-performing countries kind of across 10 years, the last 10 years of data collection. We've seen a significant increase in the Seychelles score over the course of 10 years. So, and that has, over the course of the data collection period has become one of the highest performing countries in our index. Tunisia has had a long kind of upward trajectory that unfortunately we saw a bit of a reversal this year. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it is still one of the highest performing countries on our index. And finally, Namibia actually this year took the 5th place position, overtaking Cabo Verde in our index. As far as lowest performing countries, as you can see, Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea, and Somalia have consistently also been 3 of the worst performing countries on our index, and have across the board had consistently low scores across pretty much every indicator. So we can also talk about the most improved countries for this year. So Mali had the highest increase in score from last year to this year, as you can see on the chart up here. So this is actually despite a coup d'etat that happened during the research period. We still saw a significant increase across several indicators that increased the overall score. However, the research period did not cover the period where they did end up postponing elections. So we expect their score to drop perhaps in the next round of data collection, but that is yet to be seen. That will be up to the researcher and the project managers to decide as well. But however, we have seen Morocco consistently gain over the course of the last 10 years. So continued improved trajectory for them. And Malawi also has had a significant increase in its score this year. Our biggest decreases in score on the country level this year, Tunisia, as I mentioned, has kind of reversed a constant upward trajectory over the last 10 years. And mostly this is due to, or it's partly due to the fact that they closed the headquarters of their anti-corruption body this year, as well as some other worrying trends across the country. Ghana has also had a steady decline over the last 5 years or so of data collection, and has continued that trend this year. And then finally, Cabo Verde, which was once among the top 5 performing countries, has also seen a bit of an erosion in its score, partly due to executive influence in the work of the judiciary. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you very much, and back to you, Ziwandele. I think you're on mute.
My apologies, I forgot to unmute myself. I was thanking Max for his very brief and enlightening delivery about some of the main issues that are coming out from the findings of cycle 10. Just as an aside, Max is joining us from his base in Washington, DC. The previous speaker, Alex Gia, is joining us from right here at the Malawi offices of AFIDEP. Rose is usually at the Kenya offices of AFIDEP, but she just happens to be with us for this week. So thank you very much, Max, for that presentation. So those who are following what is happening in the chat section, the support team has asked those who are participating to feel free to drop any questions that they have, really basing on whatever information they may have about the findings of cycle 10, as well as based on the presentations that we have received from both Max and Alex. So before we go ahead, with the program, we have invited a number of discussants whose role this afternoon, well, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from, whose role is going to be helping all the participants in this webinar to make sense of the findings. They are going to do this in from a number of ways based on the presentations that we have had. And the project management team has also tried as best as it can in the preceding days to try and also give them as much information and grant them as much access to the index as possible so that they are able to make very well-rounded deliveries when they give us their impressions. And they are really experts in their field. And can I just let them know also that they are free to pose questions to the gentlemen who have given us presentations. I'm sure that both Max and Alex are ready to take questions should they come, either from the general participants as well as the discussants. So I'm going to introduce the first discussant that is going to be giving us, her impressions about the information that she has been able to get access to and what she has heard from the presentations. The first is going to be Martha Muntali. She is a senior policy officer on economics and statistical matters, working with the African Union Advisory Board against corruption. So this is one of the organs of the African Union, which promotes the fight against corruption. So those who have some familiarity with the indicators know that anti-corruption is quite a prominent matter, which actually has a number of indicators dedicated to it. So we are going to ask Martha to give us her impressions about how the countries have fared on the indicators that are related to anti-corruption, how the countries have fared in general, how individual countries have fared, speak to why, for example, she thinks that the top performers have performed the way that they've performed, why the poor performers have performed the way that they've performed, try and also make sense about the changes that have occurred, those that have had big improvements, those that have had drastic regressions, and those that have been able to maintain some level of stability. She can also even venture some thoughts about what she thinks needs to be done really to improve, what countries need to do to improve their policy landscape to try and improve on those particular indicators on anti-corruption. I think I've tried to unpack really the role that the discussants are going to be playing this afternoon. Can I hand over to you now, Martha, to give us your impressions of the indicators in your area of expertise? Over to you, Martha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Njovu. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate AFIDEP for the launch of the Africa Integrity Indicator. And I think it's really a good thing because evidence is really critical for any intervention that an organization or a body wants to do. So I think it's really important in terms of the work that AFIDEP is doing. Maybe for the sake of those who do not know much about the AUABC, it's an organ of the African Union, which is charged with the mandate to follow up on the implementation of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And we see the work that is being done in the Africa Integrity Indicators as something that really aligns to the work of the board. Specifically, I'd like to draw to your attention the convention itself has indicated what the state parties that have ratified, that have signed and ratified the convention. And the basic thing, as you be able to appreciate, is where the state parties are supposed to criminalize corruption as an offense, to create corruption as an offense. And seeing through the indicators, one can be able to appreciate how the indicators have tried to align themselves even to the instruments of the African Union. And I guess also even with the UNCAC itself, the UN Convention Against Corruption. And then the second part in the convention, it goes further to look at the implementation now. Once the country as a basic has criminalized, now there are also some provisions that the state party needs to do. And these will look at issues of the prevention of corruption as well as the enabling environment. So if we look at the indicators, when you're talking about, for example, in practice, allegations against senior level politicians are investigated by any independent body. So the first thing that for us, the country needs to do as per Article 4 of the AU Convention is talking about establish an independent body. So I think in law, as we have put it, in law, the body must be in place. And then how it's implementing or it's following up on the implementation, because most of them have an Anti-Corruption Act, which they implement. So I think looking at the countries, using the indicators from the African Integrity Indicators, the countries that have performed well, already we need to look at, in law, they have established all these legal frameworks. They have established the institutions and also the enabling environment. I think for me, that is very key, because that is what is behind the data, the enabling environment. For example, even the convention itself talks about issues of anti-money laundering, talks about issues of asset recovery, access to information, which is very critical. And because of that, it helps the institutions to be effective, because they have mechanisms and means to be able to call on the law to be active. So I think we can also, in the same manner, look at the West performance. I wouldn't call them West performance. For me, I think they didn't do well, but I think there's something behind it. So I think for us, our interest as African Union, as AUABC, is to look at what is behind the performance, the scores that each of the countries have gotten. And therefore, the data then can be used for evidence for example, to check if the enabling environment was put in place, the National Intelligence Unit to deal with the issues of money laundering, or the institutions, the strategies, the policies, are they available to support those countries to be able to do better in terms of enhancing the anti-corruption strategy, so to say. And I think one thing that I also wanted to say, the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption does follow up the implementation, and we do country reviews. And my initial analysis of the indicators with what we have done so far, the countries that we have reviewed so far, we are able to see some similarities. So I think at some point in time, I think we could be able to triangulate, because there are already review mechanism even for the UN Convention, and see if the trends that are showing in the African Governance Integrity Indicator, have those similarities and trends. I think it will help us even to formulate strategies that can help these countries to do better, so to say. I don't know if I still have time.
You still have time. You still have time.
Okay,
I will let you know.
Okay, so, okay, thanks. So you can see that in trying to understand the indicators, I think it's important to also understand what is behind those indicators. When I opened the one of the indicators, yeah, even the sources itself, there's a lot of still of perception and even one-time events and occurrences that would have affected, so to say, in my opinion, the score, because you're looking at in that period of time what had happened and how that now contributes to the scorecard. Well, I think one of the key issues that for us as member states of the African Union has interested upon us is to be able to bring out issues that will have a policy implication, because the government works with policies. So if there's an issue that the anti-corruption authority in that country needs to address, the indicators should be able to help us in that area. So I think for me, I think the basic thing is, I think we really need to read behind the data, specifically for the countries that have not done well in courts, and for example, we're looking at Eritrea, Somalia, Gambia as countries, as we're calling them worst performers. But we look at even the governance standards. In some of them, they're not there. The basic infrastructure, the enabling environment that I talked about, it's not there. So it's unless we really find a means to be able to categorize these countries, because the fundamental principles, institutions, policies, they are not there. So I think this data also in some way helps us to be able to focus. I think for now, this is the area that we need to focus. And I had one question that I can pose to the developers or to the team, is that I saw, as Dr. Alex presented, that the in-law indicator was last updated in 2018. So if I'm looking at the data for now, I have to compare the in-law with the 2018. I think in as much as legal frameworks do not change so much, but I think it would be better so that if somebody is doing a snapshot of the analysis, because things can change. For example, some can pass a law within this period of 4 years, and that could even help or could contribute to things happening in that country, which now would influence the scorecard. So therefore, I think there's thinking if there could be a way whether to say this has not changed since 2018. I think it will show a scenario, or it remains the same, or maybe now if the change has come, it's going to help us to track even the legal framework if it has changed or not, because we cannot start to evaluate, so to say, or to assess, unless the legal framework is there. So if it's there, if there's anything there that has changed, or maybe the other stakeholders within the country had raised issues with the laws. For example, following up from Malawi, the parliament has just passed an amendment on the Corrupt Practices Act, which allows the Director General of Anti-Corruption Bureau to prosecute without consent from the DPP. So that means if this had happened in 2019, it would be missed in the in-law regarding some issue. So I think to me that was the comment that I had. So for now, I think I can end there and come in later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha, for your submissions. I take it that you posed a question, or was it a clarification to Alex? Have you organized yourself, Alex? Are you ready to take to address the question that came from Martha?
Yes. Thank you, Martha, for the good observation. Yes, indeed, we now mainly focus on in-practice indicators. The main issue was that the in-law indicators, the scores weren't changing much over the period. So it was thought that we need to hold them until for some time until we take a look at it then and then decide whether we should also continue with the in-law indicators as well. But however, when the researchers are carrying out the research as well, even though they are looking at in-practice indicators, if there are major changes in terms of the legal frameworks, this is also captured in the comments within the in-practice indicators, although they do not have the impact in terms of the score for the in-practice indicators. But we are going to look at also the in-law indicators after some time to see if we should still continue with them or not. But indeed, it's also important to take a look at the legal framework as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for those responses. Just a very short follow-up question, very short follow-up question to Martha. When you're talking about the poor performing countries, you did try and attribute some of their performance to a particular event that could have happened. So in cases of countries like Eritrea, would you have, for example, an example of what kind of events can influence the performance of these countries? Is it something like, is it strife? Is it civil war? So what kind of events are we talking about here?
Thank you, Doc. I think in my submission, what I was trying to refer to is when you go to the indicator, they're able to give examples of how or the sources. So you find that the sources would be kind of like at the time the research was going on, the data collection, something that had happened at one time, and that contributes to whether, for example, the Ethics and Integrity Committee in Kenya had arrested and took to court some politician. Okay, so because in as much as that incident in the perception, because it's until that case is completed, but in the perception with the citizens, they will see this country is fighting corruption. But now in the countries like Eritrea, Somalia, because the basics are not even there. The basics and so for me, for the West performance, it's more to do with the fundamentals that are supposed to be there, even if us to start assessing their governance standards, so to say. While for the countries that are doing better, it's because there's active engagement. For example, the media is able to pick up stories and put them in the media. Therefore, the citizens are active, whether on social media. Therefore, the researchers or the data collectors are able to pick those and be able those to form part of issues that are contributing to the scorecard or to an area. For example, whether it's like, for example, indicator 12, that the independent body is able to take to task senior politicians or senior civil servants. So that was my perspective. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Martha. Let's move along with the program. Can I introduce the next discussant, a good colleague going by the name Sarah Wesonga, who works with Article 19 East Africa. as a program officer. And in her work, she leads Article 19's work in promoting and enabling legal policy and actual environment for transparency, for the flourishing of information, media rights, and also, for freedom of expression. And I'm also learning that the work also does touch on anti-corruption. So it looks like that the work that Sarah does actually touches on a lot of the Africa integrity indicators. I'm also aware that she led a project that was looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic and how the governments of the countries, how their responses to COVID-19 impacted on the enjoyment of freedom of expression, a project that I was also, privileged to participate in the not too far past. So I note that the team, had asked really Sarah to look at a number of issues around freedom of expression, issues around matters to do with women's participation that Max also touched on. Issues of anti-corruption may also come in, as well as issues to do with the handling of the pandemic. So can I hand over to you, Sarah, to take us through your impressions of the indicators regarding those number of indicators that you were able to access. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mziwandile. It's good to see you again. And first of all, I'd like to thank AFIDEP for this opportunity, and also congratulate you on the launch of the 10th round of the Africa Integrity Indicators. It's been over a decade, and anyone who's been in this space knows continuity for 10 years. It's something short of a miracle. So I'd like to congratulate you for that. We're also very familiar why data is very important in our day-to-day life, especially as civil society, as people within the governance space. I think I like to say without data, you're basically spreading rumors, or you're making your decisions based on rumors and hearsay, because you're not able to measure what exactly you're doing. And so I'd like to congratulate the team for that. As Mziwandile has said, my name is Sarah. I work with an institution called Article 19. Article 19 is an organization that works for a world where everybody is in a position to access information and be able to speak without fear of retaliation from government or other entities. We were named after Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I work at the regional office, which is the Eastern Africa office. We do have other offices across the globe, about 9 hubs. And so for the purposes of today's presentation, my focus would, as Ms. Andila said, would be on freedom of expression and access to information. And I'll also speak briefly on, gender representation, especially in governance. Just to kick it off, these indicators between 41 and 56 on freedom of expression and information. And if you saw Max's initial presentation, the picture is not very merry. To start off, I'd say, Africa tends to be considered as a very secretive society by nature. And this is also seen in how our governments work. Governments tend to operate in a culture of secrecy and opaqueness when it comes to matters of basically how they're handling everything. And, this often tends to limit how then are we able to hold our African governments into account. We're not able to hold them into account. We are not able to hold these governments into account. And this is also visible in the right to freedom of information specifically. And what Martha has also just, touched on, looking at the law, or rather the legal framework around freedom of expression, or rather access to information. I think For me, it's positive. I would say the legislative framework, if you look over the past decade in terms of African countries adopting and implementing laws that speak to the right to information, I think at the moment about 66% of the African population live in a country that either has an access to information law or policy. And this is quite positive. But if you compare this to the global angle, or rather the global percentage, it's a bleak picture, because it's 98% of the global population that lives in a country with an access to information law policy. Compare this to 60% in Africa, we still have a long way to go. I think the latest country to adopt a law was the Gambia, that was last year. And we're seeing these positive improvements, and hopefully we'll be able to see how this progress, compounds as the years go by. And so unfortunately now this is where the disconnect comes in when it comes to in practice. Despite having these countries that have very progressive access to information laws, the continent is very much struggling when it comes to implementation. Citizens are not able to use these laws to be able to acquire government related information. And the access to information, the whole access to information right is premised on the idea that the information that the government holds does belong to the citizens. Basically, the government is just a custodian of information. It holds the information on behalf of the citizens. And if you look at, the indicators, according to AFIDEP, unfortunately, the entire continent is very much struggling when it comes to implementation of this. Tunisia is actually the only country that is actually implementing this right, and followed by Rwanda, Ivory Coast, I think Burkina Faso, Namibia, in Botswana. That is literally a handful of African countries. And so this shows that, a number of countries tend to be very fast to adopt laws, but when it comes to implementation, that's where the struggle comes in. And this is also clear when you come and look at indicators that speak to legislative openness. How is the legislature open in these African countries? Are people able to engage in parliament? Are they able to access legislative documents? And we've seen, like, there's been, over the past decade, there's been an improvement across the board in terms of proactively disclosure, in terms of governments and the legislature in general, proactively disclosing certain information. Still a lot of work needs to be done, but at least this is one area that we can see a number of governments trying. But then again, when you're thinking about legislative openness, this also speaks to just how citizens able to participate, to meaningfully participate, not just participate, but to meaningfully participate in legislative processes or in governments, in their own government. Because without this information, citizens are not able to know what the parliament is doing. Their opinions are not being taken into consideration. They're not able to access such documents. And so we've seen that quite a number of countries are doing this in terms of proactively disclosing this information, allowing citizen participation in, could it be budgetary and other processes, and at least there is some progress on that end. And still on the same vein, we're tying this to asset disclosure when it comes to transparency and accountability, being able to hold government into account. You see that a number of countries also really struggling with issues around asset disclosure, especially amongst government officials. I know right now, if I ask everyone in the audience, almost everyone across the board can mention at least 2 corruption scandals in their specific country that relates to mismanagement of assets by certain leaders. And, unfortunately, and this is not just because, that there is no system or process for proactive disclosure of this information or asset declaration. Unfortunately, it is a practice that has plagued the African continent. I think if you look at the integrity indicators for the 10th cycle that we just launched, I think only Ethiopia, South Africa, and Malawi do have asset disclosure practices that are being effected. And this is actually quite relative, because it's at around 50%. So, and the issue is not that there is no sound proactive disclosure practices or enforcement across the board. You see, like a number of countries do have a law or a code of conduct that, warrants or operationalizes or requires that government or state or government actors or state officials to be able to disclose their assets, or a mechanism to enforce this. So when it comes to asset disclosure, I think in a number of countries we see either partial or incomplete disclosure, or the selective enforcement, because a number of our countries tend to pick and choose when and what they want to enforce. So you see selective enforcement around the election cycle, or when it's a certain, caliber of leaders trying to be selected. It could be the judiciary or, independent commissions. So that, very much remains a challenge. And so this then brings me to the second part of what I'm discussing, and that is freedom of expression, because access to information goes hand in hand with freedom of expression and press freedom. And as Mark said, actually, truthfully, there's been a steady decline in the continent when it comes to media freedom of expression. And this is not just in Africa, actually, this is a global phenomenon. And if I could link this to the research by Article 19, our Global Expression Report shows that right now, only 15% of the global population lives in a country that has the right to freedom of expression, or a country where they're able to freely speak or access information. So this is not a Kenyan problem, it's not an African problem, it's not an Eastern Africa problem, it's a global problem. And actually, if you look at where we are, it's taking us to where we were in 1989. I wasn't even born, but I'm not even sure about the situation that was there. What I know is that this is not a situation where we want to be at the moment. So we've seen this, when it comes to freedom of expression or press freedom, there's a major struggle across the continent, especially with the exemption of actually Gambia, Namibia, and Tunisia, to be honest. And these are countries that normally are not usually, considered to be progressive when it comes to fundamental rights, with the exemption of Namibia, obviously. So you can look at that. We've seen a number of the issue of government censorship being playing a big role when it comes to the decline of press freedoms. And when we, I think we've conducted, engagement, especially in the Eastern African region, what we've noticed is that, especially in Africa, government tends to, when it comes to self-censorship, beyond restrictive laws, beyond, heavy-handed tactics by government officials, one of the things that usually acts as a propeller for government censorship is the restriction of media freedom, in the sense of advertisements. Government tends to be the biggest advertiser in most countries, government and multinationals. So this means that the media is very much dependent on their revenue from certain government entities. And so what we saw in a number of cases is where, whenever the media does investigative pieces or critical pieces or pieces that are critical to how the government is being run, then this revenue is threatened to be withdrawn. And as such, they have to practice self-censorship around this. We've also seen a number of what we call clawback laws. And I'm also referencing to what Martha said, that sometimes you find that in law, there's one thing that says, but even with the recent issues around COVID-19, pandemic response, they're usually emerging issues day by day that tend to allow loopholes for governments to be restrictive on certain issues. So like if you look at it, when it came to pandemic response, in as much as certain countries that had progressive media laws had clawback provisions under the guise of national health, or not trying to spread misinformation in the guise of COVID-19 and all that. So COVID-19 was being used as a panacea of infringing on media freedoms and information rights. And so that is, paints a very bleak picture. And this, with the emergence of not just the pandemic, but changes in terms of digital rights and digital freedom, we are seeing freedom of expression being extended online. And unfortunately, even in the online space, it's become very restrictive. I think we've had so many countries where there's been internet shutdowns or internet blockades, either during the pandemic, especially around election period. Look at the case of Ethiopia, look at, Uganda. There's so many countries that you can point out when it comes to, restrictions of freedom of expression online. And so for me, that I would want to say that we still have a long way to go as a continent, to be honest. We still have quite a long way to go when it comes to freedom of expression and information. But all in all, yeah, I would say the situation is not bleak. We are trying in one end, the other end still needs a lot of work. Thank you, Mziwandile.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for your submissions, for reminding us that the government is a custodian of information, really, that actually holds the information on behalf of the citizens. And also, you know, the talk around countries, you know, quickly adopting laws, but then struggling when it comes to implementation. Could I ask, is there anything really that you want to ask either Max or Alex?
Sorry, I think I was muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, it was just to reference what Matt had earlier said about in practice, the in law versus in practice, because I think in my experience, we tend to see progressive, you know, legal provisions and then clawback laws as a way that governments enact a very progressive law. And so if you ask if country X has this law, you know, it will say that it has, you know, X and Y law, but then it usually has certain clawback policies, you know, that tend to infringe on that particular law. So I needed to see how, if that is an area that, because if you look at a number of indicators, in law tended to be null. Like there was no data on the same, like 2022 data or 2021 data on the same. So yeah, I wanted to know if this is an area that you had considered looking at. And then also when it comes to certain rights, especially when you look at freedom of expression or information or press freedom generally, if there's any documentation on specific violations against media workers, then it's easier to say that, you know, Kenya has X number of, you know, yeah.
Thank you very much. Those are succinct. Max, Alex, any quick, brief remarks?
I can address at least one of those questions.
Max.
Sure. So to address your second question, for specific cases, you can look at the country level data, and for particularly the media indicators, if that's what you're specifically interested in. But across all indicators, should the actual, you know, the comment, explanatory comment for the score usually will capture different cases of media censorship or censorship of citizen created content. And usually that will reflect what, I mean, it's supposed to reflect what the score is for that year. And if there's a change in score from year to year, we do require justifications, usually for those two indicators, like, oh, we've seen more of these cases and here are the cases, and usually we'll have a set of sources. So for anyone who's interested in looking at the specific cases across any indicators, we had a couple questions in the chat about COVID-related governance and corruption issues as well. So yeah, for that kind of, for information on specific cases, you should look at the country level data. It's a really rich resource, and not just for AI 10, it's across the last 10 years of data collection. Regarding the in-law situation, I'll leave that to Alex as far as future plans on whether or not to assess the in-law indicators. I just, for global integrity's perspective, we stopped assessing them in after 2018 because it was kind of like, it involved a lot more resources on our part. And because the laws didn't change very often, we thought about reassessing them every 3 years instead of every year. And then just on the third year, we ended up, we're transitioning it to AFIDEP. So we figured it wasn't the right time to reintroduce that particular concept, but I will let Alex answer if they have any specific plans about reintroducing that.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Max. Yeah, indeed, the issue of the in-law indicators has always been coming in. So it's a thing we will try to see if we can introduce, as Max has already highlighted that mostly it was the issue of resources and the like, but we'll take a look at it and see if we can be assessing it for a certain period of time rather than yearly as we used to do. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for those quick remarks, Max and Alex. So that we move ahead with the program, I'm now going to introduce the last discussant that is going to be working with us this afternoon. Can I introduce a colleague that is working as a senior research fellow with the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the University of Cape Town, joining us from Cape Town, South Africa. And more importantly for this platform, this is a colleague that coordinates the International Commission of Jurists Center for Independence, for the independence of judges and lawyers. Can I introduce Dr. Justice Alfred Mavedzenge, who is going to be speaking really on issues that are looking at issues of the independence of the judiciary, matters of the rule of law. He is also going to touch on matters of elections, the indicators that look at elections, as well as the indicators that look at the state's enforcement of socioeconomic rights. He publishes extensively on matters to do with these particular indicators, and he has also led some very important public interest litigation on some of the issues around these indicators. Dr. Justice Alfred Mavedzenge, can I give you the floor?
Thank you very much, my brother Mzi, and congratulations to you and your team for launching these findings. I've been able to go through part of them in the past 2 days. Of course, I wish this event had happened at a different time than now. I'm not in the best state of my health, but let's see how far we can go with this. So the way I would like to sort of give my remarks is starting by something more general, and then I will give a review of some of the specific indicators that was some of the data that has been collected around certain specific indicators. I think the first thing that I would like to say is that this is a job well done. I think the findings do resonate with what some of us are seeing in our day-to-day work. And I think these findings do give us some kind of evidence that we can use to continue with the kind of advocacy that we are doing to try and promote the independence of the judiciaries on the continent. So when we are talking about the integrity of a state or African or integrity generally on the continent, the rule of law is a big indicator, and I'm very happy that you have incorporated that into your scorecard or into your survey. And rule of law really is understood in many ways, but I think the easiest and most practical way of understanding the rule of law is to look at it as a transition from the stage where there is a good law in place, and the good law is enforced, right? So in other words, that means we are moving from law to judgment, right? But then you're not just ending with the judgment, you are also moving from judgment to justice. So in other words, we are saying there must be a positive judgment, and that judgment must be implemented or must be complied with. And then you can say you have the rule of law. And in that ecosystem or in that chain, the independence of the judiciary is of paramount importance. In other words, you must have a judiciary that is independent to interpret the law as it is and to come up with a judgment which vindicates the law or the good law. So in other words, it's not enough to just have a good law in place. You need to translate the law into judgment. And I think this is what indicator 1 to indicator 5, if I'm not mistaken, or 3, is really trying to track. And I think that's a job well done there. Now, the second point I would make is when you are looking at the independence of the judiciary, you need to look at, or usually we look at the independence of the judiciary, we look at whether there are certain safeguards are in place and whether those safeguards are respected and implemented. So what are some of these key safeguards? It's the way in which judges are appointed. The other one is financial autonomy. In other words, the judiciary must have the autonomy to manage its own resources, and it must be adequately funded to begin with. The other safeguard is security of tenure. The other one is security of benefits. The other one is this decisional independence. In other words, the independence of an individual judge to make a reasoned judgment or a reasoned decision and hand down that decision without being interfered with by anyone. So those are some of the key safeguards. And again, I think some of these safeguards are part of the specific indicators that you have been tracking. And again, that's very impressive for me. A bit more work could be done on some of the safeguards, and I think we can talk about that separately. But at this point, let me go into the last part of my discussion or my reaction by looking at 3 specific indicators that I think are very crucial for the independence of the judiciary in the way that we have looked at them. So one of them is the legal guarantee. I think that's indicator number 1, which just looks at whether there is legal guarantee of the independence of the institution of the judiciary. The issue there being that you need to have the highest law of the country recognizing and protecting and guaranteeing and creating obligations for everyone to respect the independence of the judiciary. And I think you make very interesting findings, which I agree with. I would just add, I think, one on Malawi, because I think we've been also talking about Malawi a lot. That I think Malawi has a very dangerous provision in section 119 of their constitution, which allows the president to appoint a serving judge into another public office. So in the past, we have had situations where judges were appointed, well, a judge was actually appointed to function as the executive secretary to the president, so which is an executive position. So they are still enjoying the benefits of being a judge. They just don't decide cases. But upon finishing their tenure in the executive or in that other public office, they have the choice to return to the bench. So that allows judges to move between the political arms, between the arms of the state. And that interferes or undermines separation of powers in a very big way. A classic and quite disappointing development that happened last year is where the current president despite the hope that I think many of us had when he was elected into office, he went on to appoint 2 of the judges of the High Court as ambassadors in a way that I think flagrantly violates the separation of powers and threatens the independence of the judiciary. I'm happy to talk about how this actually undermines the decisional and the public perception of the independence of the judiciary, even in the greater detail. But I think at this point, I would just end to point out those aspects. But otherwise, I do agree with the findings concerning the other countries, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and so forth. I think you're on point there. The second indicator that I would like to react on is, concerns what I have characterized as decisional independence. So here, I think this is indicator number 2, where you are looking at the independence of the judiciary in practice. Of course, I think that means a lot of things when you say the independence of the judiciary in practice, because it means in practice respecting all those safeguards that I spoke about. But I think a lot of the information is around, and that is important actually, is around the decisional independence. In other words, to say, after all is said and done, are the judges making decisions independent? Are they applying the law independent of influence and control, or undue influence and undue control? And I agree with the findings. I would only add that it's also very important to look at the performance of the lower levels of the judiciary, such as the magistracy. The magistrates in many of the jurisdictions across the continent are at the coalface of the justice system. In other words, this is where many of the disputes are actually, legal disputes are actually resolved, especially for the majority of the population. Of course, the high level sort of cases end up in the High Court and so forth. But if you look at countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, you see how the magistrates or the magistrates court is weaponized to persecute human rights defenders, to persecute those who are perceived as political dissenters. You just need to look at how the trend in which bail applications are dealt with. You need to look at the inordinate delays in the way that criminal trials are processed, and in the process violating the right to fair trial and so forth and so forth. But the point is, we need to look at we also need to look at the performance of the lower levels of the judiciary in terms of whether they enjoy decisional independence or not. And I think on Uganda, an interesting development, which I think is very indicative of the level of decisional independence, is the case of Justice Esther Kaskia. I hope I have pronounced the name correctly, who attempted to deliver a dissenting judgment in the election petition and was literally blocked from doing so. That is interfering with the decisional independence of a judge in a very important matter such as an election petition. Then the third indicator that I think is a very important indicator that you looked at is I think indicator number 3 on appointments. Because the way in which judges are appointed, or the way in which judicial officers are appointed, in fact, I would say let's make reference to judicial officers as opposed to judges, because that allows us to look at all levels of the judiciary. So the way in which judicial officers are appointed is very important. A couple of years ago, we drafted together with the Southern Africa Chief Justice Forum something called the Lilongwe Principles on the appointment of judicial officers, where the issue is the appointments must not only be, the procedures must not only be legally guaranteed in the Constitution, but they must also be driven by an independent body, and they must be transparent. They must be based on a fair and on a fair criteria which respects merit and so forth. And I agree with your findings. I just want to flag out that the major problem across the continent actually is that the appointment procedures are not driven by an independent body. They are driven mostly by either of the two political arms of the state, that is the executive or parliament. So you have situations where judges are appointed by the president. Well, sometimes they're appointed from a list of candidates who have been nominated by the Judicial Service Commission, but then the president is not bound to actually appoint from that list. In a few cases, such as South Africa, I think Zimbabwe also, concerning appointment of judges to certain specific courts, the president is bound by what the Judicial Service Commission says. But a big problem is that the Judicial Service Commission, the way it is constituted, does not guarantee the independence of that body. You see, even in South Africa, as a top performer, but you also need to look at the composition of their Judicial Service Commission and how that commission is constituted. I agree with you that the results, the decisions, the processes as managed by that body so far have produced judges who are impeccable, judges who have been able to some extent to uphold their independence in terms of their decision making. But you can already start seeing that the involvement of politicians in that body is beginning to polarize the discussions. Is beginning to polarize the discussions, especially when during the selection of judicial candidates for the different courts. Then there are countries where the procedures for the appointment of members of the Judicial Service Commission or the other bodies that are responsible for disciplining judges, those procedures are not guaranteed in the Constitution, but they are actually guaranteed in the legislation. That is very dangerous because the legislation can be changed by any party that enjoys majority in parliament. So a case in point is Zambia, right? And it is important that such procedures and the membership for such a body be constitutionally guaranteed and be entrenched to make sure that those procedures are protected from, manipulation by any party that might be enjoying majority at a particular given, at any given moment. I know that you had asked me to speak about election management bodies and so forth. I didn't do much review of that, but the only thing that I would say is there is a very interesting development on the continent, which some characterize as judicialization of politics, where election disputes, in particular election of the president, those disputes they always end up in court, and the court almost has to be the final arbiter on that. I don't think there is anything wrong with that, because that is the job of the court. That is what the court must do. But I think the danger is that the danger is that we start sometimes drifting away from focusing on the role that election management bodies play on their own, to sort of try and minimize those disputes and ensure that the way elections are conducted, they are conducted in a free, fair manner that is credible, which minimizes disputes and minimizes polarization, and prevents instability and so forth. So I'm happy that your indicators are also just focusing on provisions, focusing on the performance of election management bodies themselves, as separate from the role that the judiciary plays, because I think it helps to enrich the conversation around the role that election management bodies must play to ensure that we have election results that are not necessarily accepted by everyone, but that are credible to a point that we minimize disputes and we minimize polarization of society as a result of election results. Thank you very much, Mzi, for that opportunity, and thank you to your colleagues. I don't know, you often ask if we have questions. I do not have a question. I just have a suggestion that perhaps I do agree with you, and I like the approach that you are taking to look at practice, but also look at the law. So do we have the law in place? But we have to assess whether we have the law in place, and whether that law is being complied with or is being implemented, which is the practice element of it. But I would suggest that you unpack the independence of the judiciary more to incorporate financial autonomy, to incorporate in greater detail security of benefits. You see, I don't want to make a new presentation, but I'll just point out that in many of these countries, I see that you intimated conditions of service concerning Malawi and so forth. But you see, in many of these countries, sometimes the problem is not even that the problem is not that the law does not secure the conditions of service. No. The law does that, it secures the conditions of service. In fact, a popular provision in constitutions is that the salary of a judge cannot be reduced during their tenure in office. But then the issue is that most of these governments have found their way around that provision. The salary of a judge is kept very minimal. In fact, it's so poor, right? But what then the judge gets are other unregulated benefits, in the form of, if you go to Zimbabwe, it's in the form of agricultural land. And I think in other countries, it's vehicles and so forth. Those things are not regulated. They are not part of what is protected in the law. But at the same time, that is actually their source of living. And at the same time, that is also what is that makes them beholden to the executive arm of government. So we need to have a conversation around how those benefits can be structured to make sure that the judges are not beholden to the executive for them to continue to enjoy those kind of benefits. So what I'm saying is, I think you might want to reflect more on the content of those indicators, especially around the independence of the judiciary, and say, have we taken into account all the key safeguards that we need to track, so that we can get some information on some of these safeguards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice, for that very elaborate presentation. And I take note really that there were very important submissions, particularly around how the indicators can be further improved, really to include elements such as the financial autonomy of the judiciary, as well as the security benefits, and also not to exclude the role that is played by the judicial officers rather than just focusing on the judges. So thank you very much for that, because part of the reasons that this platform is being held is to get critical feedback about how the indicators can be improved. And I can see Dr. Alex very busy with the pen and paper. He's taking your inputs very seriously. So we are now coming to the end of the webinar. And I think we need to apologize for how certain things did not work during the section. I am not seeing, a distinct question there. I'm only seeing rather a comment or a submission from David Ngeno, in which he is saying press freedom and government censorship on digital content cannot be overlooked in the fight against corruption. The press needs to be candid enough to expose all the forms of corruption. He goes on to say some media houses are, however, shown outright bias, and to some extent they collude with the governments of the day and overlook the misdeeds of the government. And really, these are some of the issues that have come out from the indicators, particularly focusing on issues to do with freedom of expression. Is there anything, just quick remarks, either from Justice, not Justice, either from Max or Alex, based on any of the issues that have come from the discussants, just very brief ones, before I ask Rose to make some closing remarks and also to touch on some of the forthcoming issues that we are going to be focusing on as we disseminate the findings of cycle 10 of the indicators. Max or Alex, if you have very brief reactions to any of the feedback that has come from our discussants, very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Zwandile. For me, I just want to also add more on the comment which Dr. Justice gave on the issue of reflecting on the indicators to add more content to it, to capture other issues. True indeed, every year before we embark on collecting the data, we look at the indicators and then also see various issues which we have faced in the previous round, so that we should add more content to the indicators. But also we take into consideration that these indicators, we should not change them much, so that they should be comparability over the period of the data since we started the data collection process. And also we look at the indicators in a sense that it should reflect the global, in terms of Africa, on what is happening on the ground, but not only looking at one specific country, but to make sure that the indicators can also be measured in another country and the like. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Any impressions on your mind, Max?
Not particularly. I just do want to again remind people that for specific country level data, it's the AII project is a very rich resource with a lot of good qualitative data as well as the quantitative scores. So I encourage everyone to look into the specific indicators that they want to look at, or specific country reports or countries and the research done for that, because our researchers do an incredible job of compiling all of the data and research across all 54 African countries. And again, congratulations on the release of the round 10 data. And I have the utmost confidence that AFIDEP will take this project and be able to actually, bring it to decision makers and people in charge of policy, and be able to affect change on the continent. So.
Thank you very much, Max, for those impressions. I know I had not really alerted you, but can I just ask Rose to come through and neatly tie up the deliberations of the day by just some closing remarks, also giving thanks to the participants and the different role players of this launch webinar. And also, since she's the custodian really of the concept, of the project, if she can also just briefly talk about some of the things that we have lined up as we continue with the process of disseminating the findings of cycle 10 of the indicators. Sorry for catching you unawares, Rose, but please come through.
Thanks, Mziwandile, for that. I'm happy to wrap up the webinar. Of course, I'll start by thanking again each one of you, particularly the panelists, for sharing your thoughts on the indicators and the results. And of course, thanking our participants. As we end this webinar, perhaps I'll just respond to some of the comments that were provided, particularly on looking at the in-law indicators. As Alex said, it's something we'll take on seriously, given the usefulness of that. So see ways in which perhaps we can collect that type of data every 3 or every 5 years. So we're not collecting it every year, but we are collecting it within periods just to meet that gap. There are also suggestions on other indicators. I think one of the panelists talked about indicators on financial autonomy, and I think a couple of other things. And I think that's very useful feedback that we can look at how those indicators can come in. So we really appreciate that. And of course, encourage other participants, if you have other thoughts that you haven't been able to share, please share with us on email on how we can make this data better. An important thing, as I said at the start, we are really keen to have conversations that stimulate action, because it's one thing to generate data, it's another thing to actually get it to change people's lives. And AFIDEP, for many of you who know us, we are keen on having data improve people's lives and not just having data for data's sake. And so I would like to request our partners here in different parts of the continent, if you have opportunities or you have dialogues or you have webinars coming up where you think that some of our experts here could present some of this data, and stimulate some dialogues in your countries, we would be very happy to do that. So please reach out to us if you're planning any events, you're planning any dialogues in your countries. We'd really be happy to fit into your existing events and stimulate some conversations around this data, particularly at country level. Because, largely today we've talked really very broadly, but country level discussions are so important to see how can country A take this forward in terms of what the data is showing. We would, of course, also like to request partners who may be here who have regional platforms or regional meetings coming up. If these issues align with whatever meetings you're planning, please invite us. We'll be happy to be part of those meetings. On our part, as a program, we are planning dialogues, in-person dialogues in Kenya and Malawi, where we have offices. So we are going to be moving forward with that. And some of you who are here who are based in Kenya, you'll likely be inviting you for in-person dialogues to discuss the Kenya data, and of course for Malawi to discuss the Malawi data. But of course, having said that, again, just emphasizing that for those of you in different countries, we'll be happy to fit in your events, because obviously we can't have these sessions in each country, which we would have loved to do, but we know that that is very resource intensive. And so we want to stand on, to partner with other institutions in other countries to facilitate conversations on these data. Of course, we also, I'm of course very, very happy that Martha, you're here from the African Union. So again, it's really good you've looked at the data. If you think that there are any opportunities at the continental level in which these data, the conversations around this data can fit in, can be useful, please let us know. We would be happy to be part of those conversations at the continental level. And of course, just noting that part of this work is really supporting and complementing the efforts of the African Union as a continental policy body. And so we are happy to fit and complement what you're doing as you can see, since you know the indicators quite well. And finally, of course, I know that some of you are here, you're in universities, in academic institutions, in research institutes. This data provides a lot of useful content for graduate research, be it for master's level students or even for PhD, who knows? So again, just encouraging you that this data is available for your students. Those who are doing master's degrees, those doing PhD degrees, we are looking for such opportunities, because we know that it's rich data, but if people are not using it, then it might not get to the level where we want it to do. So again, encouraging academia who are here to encourage your students to look at this data critically to start responding to some of the persisting governance challenges on the continent. I will stop there, Mziwandile, just to thank everyone and to note that in the activities you have planned in the next couple of months, some of you will be interacting again, but really, really grateful for this session and I've learned a lot. Thank you so much, and back to you, Mziwandile.
Thank you very much, Rose. And I think Rose has really thanked everyone. We thank you, colleagues, friends, associates, and everyone who participated in this dialogue. We hope that we'll be, interacting with you more as we disseminate some of the findings. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.